The stagecoach springs groaned under unprecedented weight as Margaret Thorne descended, her 300-pound frame requiring both the driver and his assistant to steady the wooden steps, while Gabriel Winters, thin as winter wheat, stepped forward with tears streaming down his weathered face, whispering, "You're exactly what I prayed for." The gathered townspeople of Cedar Ridge stood frozen along the dusty main street, their whispers rising like cicada song in the late afternoon heat as they watched Gabriel struggle with Margaret's trunk, his thin arms shaking with effort, but his face set with determination that silenced any offers of help from the watching men. Mrs. Henderson pressed her nose against the general store window, while the Morrison boys lounged against the hitching posts with barely concealed amusement, but Gabriel paid them no mind as he guided Margaret toward his wagon, his hand gentle on her elbow despite the shocked murmurs following their every step. Once they were seated side by side on the wagon bench, the wood creaking under their combined weight, Gabriel finally spoke, his voice carrying a rawness that made Margaret turn to study his gaunt face in the golden light. "Sarah was her name, my first wife, and she died of consumption 2 winters past," he said quietly, his knuckles white as he gripped the reins. "And I watched her disappear before my eyes, watched her waste away to nothing despite every remedy I could afford, every meal I tried to coax into her." Margaret noticed how his Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, his next words coming out rough as gravel. "The doctor said she needed weight to fight it, needed reserves her body could draw from, but she was delicate as a bird from the start, and by the end I could carry her like a child, could see every bone through her skin like she was already halfway to becoming a ghost." He turned to look directly at Margaret then, his brown eyes fierce with an emotion she could not quite name. "When I read your last letter, where you apologized for your size, warned me you were not the delicate flower most men sought, I fell to my knees right there in the post office and thanked the Lord for sending me a woman with substance enough to stay." The townspeople were still staring as their wagon rolled past, but Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the fear she had carried since posting her true weight in that final confession letter. Gabriel continued, his voice stronger now, explaining how he had nursed Sarah through 2 years of decline, spooning broth between her cracked lips, watching her collarbones protrude further each day, until holding her felt like cradling a bundle of sticks that might snap under the slightest pressure. "Your photograph showed health," he said simply. "And when you wrote of your appetite, your strength, your worry that you took up too much space, all I could think was, here is a woman who will not disappear on me, who will not leave me holding nothing but memories and burial clothes." And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The modest ranch house felt smaller with Margaret's presence filling the kitchen doorway, but Gabriel bustled about with surprising efficiency, lighting the oil lamps as evening shadows crept across the scrubbed pine table where Margaret sat, her hands folded carefully as if afraid to take up more space than necessary. The golden lamplight softened the sparse room's edges, illuminating the neat row of preserves on the shelf and the cast-iron stove that Gabriel kept polished despite his bachelor status, and Margaret found herself relaxing slightly as he poured coffee with steady hands that seemed more suited to this domestic task than to wrestling with heavy trunks. She cleared her throat, knowing she owed him the same honesty he had given her on that wagon ride, and began to speak about the photograph she had sent him 3 months ago, the one taken when she was 19 and weighed barely half what she did now, before cholera swept through Philadelphia and took her parents and 2 brothers in the span of 6 weeks. "That girl in the picture died with them," she said quietly, watching Gabriel's face for signs of disappointment or disgust, but finding only patient attention as he settled across from her, his thin frame barely disturbing the chair. "After Papa died, I inherited his bakery on Market Street, and at first I tried to run it just as he had, but every morning when I needed the bread, I remembered his hands teaching mine, and every evening counting the till, I heard his voice telling me I had a good head for numbers. She paused, her fingers tracing patterns on the smooth wood table, remembering those first months of hollow grief. The eating started small, just tasting the day's unsold pastries so nothing would waste, then finishing the broken cookies that could not be displayed, then making extras of everything because I told myself I needed to perfect the recipes, but really I needed to fill the empty spaces inside me with something warm and sweet. Gabriel reached across the table, his fingers barely brushing hers, but the gesture speaking volumes in the quiet kitchen. Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger as she explained how each pound gained felt like insurance against the wasting disease that had hollowed out her brothers until they looked like scarecrows in their burial suits, how her increasing size made her feel substantial and real in a world that had proven how quickly people could vanish. Every pound felt like armor against disappearing like they did, she admitted. And when the bakery finally failed because I was eating more than I sold, when the creditors came and took everything, I had nothing left but this body that proved I had survived when they had not. She met Gabriel's eyes then, surprised to find them wet, with understanding rather than judgment. When I saw your advertisement seeking a bride, when you wrote about wanting someone to build a life with, rather than just ornament your home, I thought maybe you could accept me as I am. But I sent that old photograph because I was terrified you would see my size and think me grotesque or gluttonous, rather than someone who had simply chosen to live abundantly when death had taken everything else. The morning sun painted the 40-acre ranch in shades of gold and amber as Margaret emerged from the house at dawn. Finding Gabriel already struggling to load 50-pound feed sacks onto the wagon bed, his thin arms trembling with the effort of lifting even one, while sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Without speaking, Margaret moved beside him and hoisted 2 sacks at once, one under each arm, loading them with the same ease most women might carry baskets of laundry, and Gabriel stepped back with a mixture of relief and wonder as she completed in 10 minutes what would have taken him an hour of back-breaking labor. The chicken coop roof needed patching where last month's storm had torn loose several boards, and Gabriel had been dreading the repair, knowing his slight frame made ladder work precarious, but Margaret simply positioned him to steady the base while she climbed with confident movements, her weight making the ladder sink slightly into the dirt, but her hands sure and capable as she hammered new boards into place. As she worked, Gabriel explained from below how he had been planning this repair for weeks, had calculated the exact amount of lumber needed and the optimal angle for water runoff, his mind sharp with details, even if his body could not execute them alone. After the roof was secured, they moved to the barn where Gabriel spread his ledgers across a makeshift desk of stacked crates, showing Margaret columns of neat figures that revealed a surprising truth about their modest ranch, which was that despite its simple appearance, the operation turned a consistent profit through Gabriel's careful management of resources and shrewd timing of cattle sales. "The problem is not money but muscle," he explained, pointing to maps he had drawn of adjacent parcels available for purchase, plans for expanded grain storage, proposals for doubling their herd if only he had the physical means to maintain larger operations. Margaret studied his detailed calculations with growing respect, recognizing the mind of someone who understood every aspect of ranching, except how to overcome his own physical limitations, and she began to see how perfectly their strengths might interweave. By noon they had developed a rhythm, with Gabriel directing and planning while Margaret executed the heavy labor, and together they accomplished more than either could have managed alone, repairing the corral gate that had hung crooked for months, clearing rocks from the eastern pasture that Gabriel had marked for ploughing, and restacking hay bales in the barn according to his careful system that maximized space and minimized spoilage. The bright sun beat down on them as they worked, but Margaret found joy in the purposeful movement of her body, in the way her strength served immediate practical needs rather than being seen as an oddity or burden. while Gabriel discovered the pleasure of seeing his plans materialize without the usual struggle against his own limitations. As evening approached, they stood together surveying what they had accomplished. The ranch already looking more orderly and prosperous than it had in years, and Gabriel turned to Margaret with an expression of quiet amazement, saying simply that in one day she had done more to advance his carefully laid plans than he had managed in the previous 6 months working alone. The parlour had never felt smaller than when Mrs. Dalton arrived with Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Morrison, their skirts rustling with the aggressive efficiency of women on a mission as they arranged themselves on Gabriel's modest furniture, their eyes taking in every detail of the room, while Margaret served tea with hands that remained steady despite the weight of their scrutiny. Mrs. Dalton, whose husband owned the largest ranch in the valley, spoke first with the kind of false sweetness that barely masked her venom, commenting how brave Gabriel must be to take on the expense of feeding another mouth that size, her gaze travelling deliberately over Margaret's substantial frame as if calculating the cost in flour and beef. The other women tittered behind their gloved hands, while Margaret calmly set down a plate of perfectly formed tea cakes, each one decorated with delicate icing work that would have impressed any city bakery, before settling into her own chair, which creaked slightly but held firm as she met their eyes without flinching. "How thoughtful of you to worry about our household economics," Margaret replied smoothly, "though I confess I find it curious that wives who tolerate their husbands spending half the ranch profits at the saloon should concern themselves with my appetite, which costs far less than what your men pour down their throats every Saturday night." The words landed like a slap across their painted faces, and Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish, while Mrs. Morrison's cheeks flushed red beneath her powder. But before they could formulate a response, Margaret continued with the same pleasant tone. "I suppose we all have our appetites to manage, though mine at least contributes to the work of this ranch, rather than leaving me insensible in a ditch while my wife wonders if I will make it home before dawn." The tension in the room grew thick as molasses, with Mrs. Dalton's fingers tightening on her teacup until her knuckles showed white when the sound of boots on the porch announced Gabriel's arrival from the fields. He entered the parlour with dirt still on his clothes and sweat staining his shirt, taking in the scene with quick understanding before moving to stand beside Margaret's chair, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder, despite the impropriety of such a gesture in mixed company. "Ladies," he said, his voice carrying an authority that his slight frame might not suggest, "how kind of you to visit my wife, who in 3 days has accomplished more on this ranch than I managed in the previous month working alone." His brown eyes moved deliberately from one woman to the next, ensuring each felt the weight of his words. "This morning alone she repaired our barn door that your husband said would need 3 men to fix, birthed a breached calf that would have died without her strength to turn it, and still had time to bake these delicacies you are enjoying. So perhaps, instead of concerning yourselves with her size, you might consider what your own households could accomplish with a woman of such magnificent capability." The blazing afternoon sun turned the far pasture into a furnace as Gabriel struggled with the fence post driver, his thin arms shaking with each attempt to pound the thick wooden posts into the sun-baked earth that had turned hard as stone during the recent dry spell. Margaret was working on the opposite fence line when she heard the distinctive thud of a body hitting the ground, and she turned to see Gabriel crumpled beside the half-driven post, his face pale as parchment despite the heat that shimmered off the dry grass. Without hesitation she ran across the field, her heavy footfalls sending up small clouds of dust as she reached him and felt for his pulse, finding it rapid and weak, while his skin burned with dangerous heat that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with the sun sickness that claimed careless ranchers every summer. She tried to rouse him, but his eyes remained closed, his breathing shallow, and Margaret made a decision that would have seemed impossible for most women, but came naturally to her as she lifted Gabriel's limp form and draped him over her shoulder like a sack of grain, his weight barely registering as she began the long walk back to the house. The journey across the pasture felt endless under the merciless sun. But Margaret's strength held steady as she carried her husband through the gate and up the porch steps, kicking open the door and moving directly to their bedroom where thick curtains blocked the afternoon light. She laid him gently on the bed and began the careful work of cooling his fevered body with wet cloths, loosening his clothes and trickling water between his cracked lips while the room remained blessedly dark and cool compared to the inferno outside. Hours passed before Gabriel's eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on Margaret's worried face as she continued to bathe his forehead with cool water, and his first words came out as a croak of shame rather than gratitude. "The Morrison brothers came by yesterday while you were at the well," he whispered, his voice rough as sandpaper, "and they said things about you, about us, about how a weak man like me could never protect a woman or hold on to land worth having." Margaret's hands stilled on the cloth as Gabriel continued, tears leaking from the corners of his eyes as he confessed his deepest fear. "They said they would take this ranch and you would be better off with real men who could handle you properly. And I wanted to prove them wrong by fixing that fence alone, by showing I could do the work of a proper husband, but instead I just proved they were right about me being too weak for this life." The vulnerability in his admission hung in the darkened room like smoke, and Margaret felt rage building in her chest at these men who would prey on Gabriel's insecurities, but she kept her voice gentle as she wiped his tears away. "They are wrong about what makes a man worth having," she said firmly, "and if they come for this ranch they will find out exactly how well I can protect what is ours, because strength comes in many forms, and ours together is greater than anything they can bring against us." The shadows were growing long across the ranch yard when the three Morrison brothers rode up at dusk, their horses kicking up dust that hung in the thick evening air like smoke as they positioned themselves strategically between the house and the barn, cutting off any escape route while maintaining the pretense of a casual visit. Tom Morrison, the eldest and meanest of the three, stayed mounted, while his brothers Jake and Samuel dismounted with the lazy confidence of men who had never met a situation they could not control through intimidation or force, their hands resting casually on their gun belts as they approached the porch where Gabriel stood alone. "Well now, Gabriel," Tom drawled, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake before it strikes, "seems some of your cattle have wandered onto our property again, and we figured we would just keep them as payment for the grass they have been eating, unless you have some objection you think you can enforce." The younger brothers laughed at this, the sound harsh as crow calls in the humid evening air, and Samuel made a show of looking Gabriel up and down, taking in his thin frame and work-worn appearance. "What are you going to do about it, Scarecrow?" he taunted, stepping closer to the porch. "You going to fight all three of us with those stick arms of yours, or maybe ask us politely to return your property while we take whatever we please from a man too weak to hold it?" Gabriel's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the front door opened with deliberate slowness and Margaret emerged, filling the doorway completely, before stepping onto the porch with Gabriel's shotgun, held with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly how to use it. The Morrison brothers' laughter died in their throats as they took in her full height and breadth. The way the shotgun looked almost small in her capable hands, and how she moved with the controlled power of someone who had never needed to prove their strength, because it was evident in every step. "Evening, gentlemen," she said pleasantly. Though the shotgun remained pointed in their general direction, I could not help but overhear some confusion about our cattle, but I am sure we can clear this up quickly once you understand how things work on this ranch. Tom's horse shifted nervously as Margaret descended one porch step, her presence somehow growing more intimidating with the change in elevation that put her eye level with the mounted man. "My husband handles the books and the business decisions," she continued, her voice calm as still water but with something dangerous underneath, "while I handle problems that need a firmer touch. And gentlemen, you are starting to look like that kind of problem." Jake's hand twitched toward his gun but froze when Margaret smoothly pumped the shotgun with one hand, the sound echoing across the yard like thunder, while her other hand remained perfectly steady on the trigger. The brothers exchanged glances, their earlier bravado evaporating as they realized that this woman could likely shoot two of them before the third could clear leather. And even if they managed to draw, getting close enough to overcome her would be like trying to wrestle a bear that happened to be armed and intelligent enough to see them coming. The storm arrived with the sudden violence of divine wrath, turning the evening sky black as coal while lightning split the darkness, and rain fell in sheets so thick that Margaret could barely see 10 feet ahead as she and Gabriel stood on the porch watching the lower pasture begin to flood. 20 head of pregnant cattle were grazing down there, too heavy with calf to move quickly, and Gabriel's face went white as he realized the creek was already overflowing its banks, turning the pasture into a death trap that would claim the entire herd if they did not act immediately. "I know exactly where to drive them," Gabriel shouted over the thunder, pointing through the rain toward a rise on the eastern side of the property. But moving panicked cattle through this mud would take 3 strong men, and we do not have time to get help from neighbors who are probably dealing with their own stock. Margaret was already pulling on an oilcloth slicker and heading for the door when Gabriel grabbed her arm, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperate hope as he explained his plan with the rapid precision of someone who understood cattle behavior perfectly even if his body could not execute what needed doing. "The lead cow always bears left when frightened, so you need to block that side and force her right toward the gate," he instructed, speaking quickly as the water continued rising. "And the younger ones will try to scatter, so you must keep them bunched by walking an arc pattern behind them. But watch the one with the broken horn because she gets aggressive when stressed and will charge if cornered." Margaret nodded and plunged into the storm, her weight actually becoming an advantage as she pushed through mud that would have trapped a lighter person, while Gabriel stationed himself at the gate to direct traffic, despite knowing he could be trampled if the herd stampeded. The rain turned the world into chaos as Margaret waded through knee-deep water toward the terrified cattle, their eyes rolling white with fear as lightning crashed overhead. But she moved with the deliberate calm Gabriel had described, using her substantial presence to create a living wall that guided them away from their instinct to flee toward the flooded creek. The broken-horned cow did charge exactly as Gabriel had predicted, but Margaret stood her ground and deflected the animal with her shoulder, using her mass to turn the cow back toward the herd without violence, just steady pressure that communicated dominance without cruelty. Through the near darkness broken only by lightning flashes, she could hear Gabriel's voice calling directions that proved invaluable as he anticipated every move the cattle would make, warning her when they would break left, telling her when to ease pressure and when to push harder, his strategic mind reading the chaos like a book while her strength provided the physical force to implement his plans. Together they moved the entire herd through the storm, Margaret driving them forward while Gabriel guided them through the gate and up to higher ground, their partnership so synchronized that it seemed like one mind operating 2 bodies. And when the last cow passed through to safety, they collapsed against each other in the rain, laughing with the wild relief of people who had just cheated disaster through perfect cooperation. The harvest dance filled the decorated barn with golden lantern light and the sweet sound of fiddle music, but the festivities took on a sharp edge when Margaret overheard Tom Morrison and his drinking companions comparing her to a draft horse while Gabriel fetched punch, their crude laughter cutting through the music. As they wondered aloud how a scarecrow like Gabriel managed to mount such a massive mare, Margaret set down her cup with deliberate calm and walked directly to their corner of the barn, her presence parting the crowd like a ship through water as she approached the group of men who suddenly found their jokes dying in their throats when faced with the subject of their mockery. "Gentlemen," she said with dangerous sweetness, "I could not help but overhear your fascinating theories about my marriage. And since you seem so concerned with questions of strength, perhaps you would care to settle the matter with a simple contest of arm wrestling." The barn grew quiet as word spread of the challenge, and Tom Morrison, trapped by his own bravado and the watching crowd, had no choice but to swagger forward and accept, though his face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. Margaret settled at the empty table someone quickly provided, rolling up her sleeve to reveal an arm thick as a fence post, and Tom barely lasted 3 seconds before his hand slammed against the wood with enough force to make the lanterns overhead swing. One by one, his companions tried their luck, each falling faster than the last, until Samuel Morrison, the strongest of them all, lasted nearly 10 seconds before Margaret drove his knuckles into the table with controlled power that suggested she could have ended it sooner, but chose to let him struggle for the crowd's entertainment. The barn erupted in cheers and laughter as Margaret stood and smoothed her dress, then extended her hand to Gabriel, who had watched the entire display with quiet pride rather than embarrassment, and as the fiddle struck up a waltz, she led him onto the dance floor with surprising grace. Despite her size, Margaret moved with the fluid elegance of someone who understood their body perfectly, guiding Gabriel through the steps with a gentleness that contrasted beautifully with the strength display moments before, and the crowd watched in growing amazement as they realized this unlikely couple moved together with genuine harmony. As the dance ended and the crowd applauded, Gabriel raised his voice to make an announcement that would silence any remaining doubters about their marriage's success. "We want to share with our neighbors the joyful news that Margaret is 3 months along with our first child," he declared, his thin arm wrapped proudly around his wife's substantial waist. "And we look forward to raising our family as part of this wonderful community that has made us feel so welcome." The barn fell silent for a moment as the implications sank in, that this strange pair had found not just partnership but love and fertility, then burst into genuine congratulations that drowned out any remaining mockery from the Morrison brothers, who slunk away to the whiskey barrel, defeated not just physically but socially, as the community embraced what they had tried to tear down. The sun stood directly overhead when 6 men rode into the ranch yard, their horses arranged in a half-circle that blocked any escape route, while Tom Morrison dismounted with the swagger of someone who believed superior numbers guaranteed victory, having learned nothing from his previous encounters except that he needed more backup. Gabriel stood on the porch gripping his rifle with white knuckles while Margaret emerged from the house. But this time, the Morrison brothers had brought 3 hired guns from the county seat, hard men with scarred faces who made their living enforcing claims that could not stand legal scrutiny. "We tried being neighborly about those cattle and your woman humiliated us in public," Tom announced, his voice carrying across the dusty yard. "So now we are taking this whole ranch as compensation for our damaged reputation, and you can walk away alive if you are smart enough to recognize when you are beaten." The hired guns spread out with practiced precision, their hands hovering near their weapons as they watched Margaret for any sign of the strength that had become legend in town, but she simply stood beside Gabriel with her arms crossed, showing no sign of fear despite being outnumbered 6-2. "Your move, Lady Giant." Samuel Morrison sneered from his horse, thinking you can arm wrestle your way out of this situation, or maybe you plan to dance us into submission like you did at the barn last week. Margaret smiled then, a expression that made several of the men shift uneasily in their saddles before putting 2 fingers to her lips and letting out a sharp whistle that echoed across the ranch yard like a dinner bell. The barn door swung open with deliberate slowness, and out walked Mrs. Hammond, the blacksmith's wife, who stood nearly 6 feet tall and had arms like oak branches from years of working the forge alongside her husband, followed by Mrs. Garrett, whose German farming stock had blessed her with shoulders broader than most men and the strength to match. Behind them came Mrs. Cooper, who ran the feed store and could throw 100-pound sacks like pillows, then Mrs. Peterson, whose husband's illness had left her to work their ranch alone for 2 years until she had muscles that rivaled any cowhand, and finally Mrs. Wilson, whose natural size had always made her an outcast until Margaret had shown her that strength could be a blessing rather than a burden. The 6 women arranged themselves beside Margaret, creating a wall of female power that made the horses nervous and their riders even more so, as Tom Morrison realized his numerical advantage had just evaporated. "For the past month I have been teaching these ladies that strength is nothing to be ashamed of," Margaret announced, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "And we have discovered that when men like you threaten one of our families, you threaten us all. So, gentlemen, if you want to take from one of our husbands, you take from all of us." The hired guns exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for this development, as they had been paid to intimidate one allegedly weak man and his wife, not face down 7 women who looked capable of tearing them apart with their bare hands, if properly motivated. The supposed negotiation took place in the neutral ground of the town square, with Tom Morrison claiming he wanted to discuss a peaceful resolution while Gabriel, still weak from his sunsickness but determined to protect his land, agreed to meet, despite Margaret's warnings that this felt like a trap. Jake Morrison, the youngest and most hot-headed of the brothers, stood to his older sibling's left, his hand twitching near his pistol while Gabriel spoke calmly about property lines and legal boundaries, trying to find some compromise that would end this feud without violence. The shot came without warning, Jake's temper finally snapping as he drew and fired in one motion, the bullet catching Gabriel in the chest and spinning him to the ground, where blood immediately began pooling in the dust, while women screamed and men shouted in confusion. Margaret had been standing 20 feet away, having agreed to let Gabriel handle the talking, but the sight of her husband's blood spreading across the dirt triggered something primal and terrible in her as she crossed the distance to Jake Morrison in 3 strides that seemed to shake the very ground. Before anyone could react, she had lifted Jake completely off his feet by his throat, her massive hand wrapped around his neck as she held him at arm's length like a rag doll, his boots kicking uselessly in the air, while his face turned purple and his hands clawed desperately at her iron grip. The town square erupted in chaos as Tom Morrison reached for his gun, only to find 3 of Margaret's trained women already surrounding him. While bystanders scattered and someone ran for the sheriff, but Margaret heard none of it over the roar of blood in her ears and the sight of Gabriel's still form. "You shot my husband," she said in a voice that barely sounded human, her arm showing no strain despite holding a full-grown man aloft, and Jake's eyes bulged as he realized he was about to die, that this woman possessed the strength to snap his neck like a chicken bone and the rage to do it without hesitation. Sheriff Bennett arrived at a full gallop, having been alerted by the gunshot, and found the scene frozen in a tableau of potential murder, with Margaret still holding Jake Morrison, whose struggles had grown weaker, while the doctor knelt beside Gabriel trying desperately to stop the bleeding. "Put him down, Margaret," the sheriff commanded, though his voice carried more plea than authority, "because if you kill him now, it is murder regardless of what he did, and Gabriel needs you free to help him recover, not locked away or hanged for revenge." The mention of Gabriel's name seemed to penetrate Margaret's fury, and she looked down at her husband's pale face, seeing the shallow rise and fall of his chest that meant he still lived, though the doctor's grim expression suggested it was a near thing. She released Jake, who collapsed, gasping and retching in the dirt, then turned to the sheriff with eyes that promised terrible vengeance if the law failed to deliver justice. Sheriff Bennett immediately arrested all 3 Morrison brothers for attempted murder and conspiracy to steal property, while the doctor and several men carefully loaded Gabriel onto a wagon to transport him to the medical office where the bullet could be extracted and the real fight for his life would begin. The autumn leaves had turned gold and fallen, winter snow had blanketed the ranch in white silence, and now spring buds were opening on the apple tree outside the bedroom window where Gabriel lay propped against pillows, still pale but finally strong enough to hold a pencil as he sketched expansion plans on the paper Margaret held steady for him. She had run the entire ranch alone through his recovery, rising before dawn to feed livestock and mend fences, then returning to nurse him with the same gentle patience he had once shown while teaching her letters during their evening lessons that had become precious to them both. The bedroom had transformed into a command center of sorts, with maps spread across the quilts and ledgers balanced on the nightstand, as Gabriel's brilliant mind continued working despite his body's weakness, creating detailed plans for irrigation improvements and breeding programs, while Margaret provided reports on their implementation. "I have been practicing my writing," Margaret said shyly one evening, pulling out a notebook filled with her careful script that had progressed from shaky letters to flowing sentences over the months of Gabriel's convalescence, documenting each day's work and her observations about the cattle's behavior patterns. Gabriel's eyes filled with tears as he read her entries, seeing not just improved penmanship, but a sharp intelligence that had been waiting for the tools to express itself, and he realized that while he had been teaching her to read, she had been teaching herself to think in new ways about the ranch operations. "Your notes about the creek's seasonal flow patterns are brilliant," he said softly, pointing to a passage where she had connected water levels to grass quality in different pastures, something he had never considered despite years of careful planning. Through the long winter nights when Gabriel's pain kept him awake, Margaret would sit beside him reading aloud from the agricultural journals he had collected, her voice steady and soothing as she worked through articles about soil management and cattle breeding, asking questions that showed she was not just reciting but truly comprehending the material. In return, Gabriel would dictate letters to equipment suppliers and grain merchants, teaching Margaret the language of business correspondence while she served as his hands, and together they negotiated deals that would have been impossible for either to achieve alone. As spring arrived and Gabriel could finally sit up for longer periods, they would spread the ranch maps across the bed and plan together, his strategic vision combined with her practical experience of having worked every inch of the property through winter's challenges. Margaret would describe how certain fields flooded during the February thaw, and Gabriel would sketch drainage solutions. Then she would explain which fences the cattle pressed against when the wind blew cold, and he would design windbreaks that could double as hay storage. The partnership that had begun as physical necessity had evolved into intellectual collaboration, with Margaret's notebook entries becoming more sophisticated as she documented feed ratios and breeding schedules, while Gabriel's plans grew more practical as they incorporated her hard-won knowledge of what actually worked versus what should work in theory. By the time the apple blossoms opened fully and Gabriel could finally stand with a cane, they had mapped out a 5-year plan for the ranch that reflected both of their strengths, a document written in Margaret's increasingly confident hand, but shaped by two minds working in perfect harmony. The year had transformed everything as Margaret stood at the fence line watching their expanded herd of 60 cattle grazing across pastures that now stretched twice as far as when she had first arrived. Her arm draped protectively around Gabriel's shoulders while he held one of their twins against his hip, the baby girl gurgling contentedly while her brother slept in the basket at Margaret's feet. Gabriel had gained nearly 30 pounds under Margaret's care. His frame still lean but no longer gaunt, his arms showing actual muscle from the carefully managed work she allowed him to do, while ensuring he never pushed himself toward another collapse, and his face had lost that hollow look that had so worried her in those early days. The ranch house behind them had been expanded with 2 additional rooms and a proper office where Gabriel's maps and ledgers could spread across a real desk instead of the kitchen table, while the barn stood tall and freshly painted, a testament to the prosperity their partnership had brought. Their success had not gone unnoticed in the community, with several other couples seeking their advice on everything from cattle breeding to marriage itself, and Margaret had continued teaching strength and confidence to women who had been told their size was a burden rather than a blessing. The Morrison brothers were serving 10 years hard labor for attempted murder and conspiracy, their ranch parceled out among neighbors with Gabriel and Margaret receiving the choicest pasture as compensation for their suffering, adding another 40 acres to their growing operation. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, they heard the familiar creak of wagon wheels that announced the weekly stage, and Margaret smiled knowingly as she recognized the nervous posture of another thin rancher waiting at the depot. Sure enough, when the stage door opened, out stepped a woman who needed both the driver and his assistant to help her descend, her substantial frame causing the same whispered shock from townspeople that Margaret remembered from her own arrival. though this time she noticed several approving nods from women who had learned to see strength differently. The skinny rancher, a young man named Peter Willis who had placed his own advertisement 2 months prior, stepped forward with the same expression Gabriel had worn. That mixture of surprise and something deeper, something that suggested he too had been praying for substance rather than delicacy. Margaret handed the sleeping baby to Gabriel and walked over to the new couple, remembering her own terror and uncertainty at this same moment, and she approached the woman with a warm smile that held understanding rather than judgment. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge," Margaret said gently to the wide-eyed bride who was clearly bracing for ridicule or rejection. "I am Margaret Winters, and I have a feeling you and I are going to be great friends, and if you ever need advice on how to handle ranch work or ranch hands," she glanced meaningfully at the gathering crowd of Gawkers, "you come find me." The woman's relief was visible as she realized she was not alone, that someone else had walked this path and found happiness on the other side of society's expectations. And as Margaret led her away from the whispers toward the warm light of Gabriel's smile and their thriving ranch, she knew they had created something more than prosperity. They had built a new model for what strength and partnership could mean on the frontier.